You're listening to Beyond Wellness Radio, bringing you the cutting edge in health, biohacking, and sports performance. Stay up to date and listen anywhere and anytime on your computer, tablet, or smartphone by subscribing on iTunes. Catch your host, Dr. Justin Marchegiani, as he answers your burning health questions as well as interviews from world-renowned guest experts. For more Beyond Wellness Radio, go to beyondwellnessradio.com.
Hey there, it's Dr. Justin Marchegiani. Welcome to Beyond Wellness Radio. Feel free and head over to beyondwellnessradio.com where you can access our full podcast transcriptions. While you're there, you can also sign up for our thyroid and female hormone video series. This series goes into the root cause of why your hormones are out of balance. While you're there, you can also schedule a functional medicine consult with Dr. Justin, myself, where we'll dig deeper into the root cause of your health challenges. Feel free and think of sharing this podcast with at least one person. This podcast grows by people sharing it. Sharing is caring. If you can think of one person that can benefit from this information, please feel free and share it. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you subscribe on iTunes. You can also click below the video or podcast where you'll see the iTunes review button and leave us a review. You can also sign up for the newsletter at beyondwellnessradio.com where you'll get updates before anyone else. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. Evan Brand, it's Dr. Justin here, man. Happy little Monday. What's going on for you?
Hey, thank you. Well, this baby's coming, apparently. That's what's coming.
It's exciting. I know we talked about it on Friday. You were getting close. Still not quite there yet, but you're almost coming down the hill on this one.
By the time the show goes out, the baby will be here.
Super exciting.
Yep.
And this is going to be a paleo baby, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Nice. So do you have a paleo baby name set up yet?
Summer.
Oh, is that the name?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
Very cool. I didn't know if it was like a last minute kind of judgment call on it. That's cool.
Thanks, man.
Perfect. And it's not quite officially summer yet. June 21st, right?
By the time the show goes out, it probably will be.
It probably will be. Yeah, it actually be past that. I guess probably come out in late June. So that's great. Awesome timing. Good to hear. Yep. Any other updates on your end here?
Everything's great. Just seem to be plucking away at any roadblocks that have been in my health journey and others' journeys. I think every week you and I chatting about a new topic is really empowering people. I'm continuing to get good feedback, some new 5-star reviews on the show for iTunes. So everybody seems to be liking the direction that we've gone with these episodes. So it's always good to have the feedback.
Love it. Love it. Any good treatment cases last week that you want to share?
Last week, let's see. I'll look at the calendar and that will help me to refresh my brain. Yeah, actually, I do have a good one. So a guy is actually a rocket engineer. He builds rockets for shooting up satellites and spaceships into outer space. And his brain is not working as well as it should be. Mm-hmm. So immediately upon starting to work with him, I got the NeuroSynergy product to him, which is several different brain vitamins. And I got an email this morning that said that his brain is starting to work better. So within less than a week, changes in cognitive function, that's pretty insane. So the huperzine and some of the other brain-boosting nutrients that I'm using with them, it's very effective. So I think sometimes we don't have to wait for people to have their lab test results. We can just immediately throw some nutrients their way that we know they'll benefit from that might help them and can't hurt them, just to give them that motivation, because you and I like to get people at least 5 to 10% better each month. And if we can get you started on some nutrients while you're waiting for your labs, then that's going to be great.
100%. Same here with me. I mean, we have lots of autoimmune patients that come in every single week. We make simple dietary changes like transitioning to an autoimmune diet and or throwing in a low FODMAP eating plan, and we see remarkable changes. And then we just add just simple things like getting extra nutrients in through a good high-quality multivitamin, getting better digestive support on board there, helping to support the hormones and the adrenals, or diagnosing any underlying thyroid imbalances and getting rid of infections. It's amazing just what type of healing capacity the body has when you just remove those roadblocks.
Absolutely. My sleep's been better than it has in probably 5 or 10 years. So who knows how long I had my gut issues going on. Like, seriously. Every day I wake up, I'm like, wow, I was sleeping deep. It's just mind-blowing.
Well, you're going to need that sleep with this new girl on the way here, so
Tell me about it.
you're going to need efficient sleep.
I know.
Great. Well, we talked today pre-show that we were going to address some topics of SIBO today. Now, we've kind of interlaced or intermingled SIBO and other topics that we've addressed on parasite infections and probiotics and other types of digestive issues. But today, this is going to be a podcast just focused on SIBO and what SIBO is essentially. And just to kind of give the abbreviation here, SIBO stands for Small Intestinal Bacterial Overgrowth. And to keep it really simple is that we have a lot of the bacteria from the large intestine kind of creeping its way back into the small intestine. In a nutshell, that is what SIBO is. It's basically bacteria from the colon kind of being in the wrong spot in the intestinal tract, typically making its way back towards the small intestine. I've done a lot of videos on this. I know you have done some stuff too. So go to justinhealth.com or notjustpaleo.com and Google just SIBO and you'll get a lot more info on this. But essentially we have that ileocecal valve that kind of is the capacitor that restricts entry from the small intestine to the large, and it starts to open up and we start to have this bacteria creeping back into the small intestinal tract.
Yeah, so looking at some of the research, the latest statistic that I found here is that in terms of like irritable bowel syndrome, SIBO is one of the most common causes of IBS. So it certainly could have been a factor for me with my IBS struggle. It says here up to 84% of IBS cases have been linked to SIBO. So if you've been told by the conventional doctor, if you go in and you have some of the constipation, diarrhea, bloating, abdominal pain, all the other symptoms that can happen, you go to the gastroenterologist that you'll probably get referred to, they'll just say you have IBS. It might be SIBO, and that's certainly what I've seen, and definitely you've talked about it all the time. You see it every single week. How many people are dealing with this? So it's, what would you say, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 people that are presenting with gut symptoms actually have SIBO?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people that are coming in with digestive issues more than likely have SIBO. The question is SIBO the root issue? So we know a lot of the SIBO symptoms are abdominal pain, discomfort, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, gas, bloating, etc. And a lot of people that have gluten issues or other infections like H. pylori or parasitic infections or fungal overgrowths, which may not be considered SIBO per se, but they tend to mimic a lot of those small intestinal bacterial overgrowth symptoms. So we want to rule those out because I consider the deeper infections upstream issues, and I can consider a lot of the SIBO stuff downstream. Now, it's not to say that SIBO isn't a contributing factor. It's not to say that we don't have to address the SIBO, because a lot of the herbs that we use to knock out the higher up infections can be sensitive to a lot of the SIBO type of overgrowth that we see anyway. So in other words, SIBO is important. Most of the people, we always want to rule out the upstream stuff first. I typically don't ever go to your typical SIBO breath test to evaluate SIBO until we've ruled out the deeper infections. Because if we have H. pylori, if we have a parasitic infection like Giardia, Crypto, or Blasto, it makes sense that the collateral damage of SIBO, or that bacterial overgrowth, will be there.
So you're saying it's not even worth it technically if you just go straight to the typical hydrogen methane test at this point. We need to really look at running the comprehensive stool panels first with people presenting with these symptoms, because that's going to give us the most bang for our buck in terms of identifying underlying causes. And if you go in and treat SIBO, but you haven't removed the infections, then people will still struggle, right?
I see that a lot. I've seen a lot of patients that have come from other functional medicine doctors that just specialize in SIBO and that have only had their SIBO treated per se, and they may use the conventional SIBO antibiotics, which are like rifaximin or neomycin, a 10 to 14 day kind of dose of that, typically 500 to 1,000 milligrams BID, depends on what the doctor prescribes on that. So I've seen that, and then they still come in with symptoms, and then we'll test, and they have Blasto or Crypto or Blasto and H. pylori. So I think SIBO is important to assess, and we'll talk about how we can assess that, but we want to rule out the upstream. I always work upstream to downstream. Yeah. What could cause the most collateral damage to the least? That's kind of how I assess things. It's pretty conservative. That way we're not doing 100 tests at once. We can start with 1 or 2 tests, focus on the gut, cross those off our list, and then go downstream to a SIBO assessment. Now, there's typically 2 for the most part. There's the more invasive sample where they're going into the intestinal tract via an endoscopy, right, through the mouth, down the esophagus, and doing some kind of a sample to look at that, get a sample of that bacterial issue. Now, that's one way. That's like the most, like the gold standard, because then okay, well, I'm getting this sample of this bacterial overgrowth sample, and it's coming from the small intestine, and we know and we can confirm that shouldn't be there. It's an overgrowth. That's like sample number one or measure number one, but it's pretty invasive.
Yeah.
Typically don't do that unless someone's very, very sick, and it's typically done by the conventional doctor ahead of time. A less invasive way is what's called a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth breath test, where they give a sample of lactulose, or sometimes if we're looking at the upper small intestine, the upper stomach, I should say, they'll give a sample of glucose. But typically lactulose, because it takes about 100 to 120 minutes, about 2 hours or so to get down into that lower small intestinal tract, by that jejunum and ileum area, that last part of the intestine. And then we can see elevations in certain gases, whether it's a elevation in methane, whether it's an elevation in hydrogen, or we're looking at a combination of methane and hydrogen together. And that's typically what we're looking at. And we'll see things, a greater than increase in methane above 3, some will say is an issue and could be indicative of SIBO. Some say above 15. Typically, if we're looking at a combination of methane and hydrogen, somewhere between 15 to 20 is going to be positive. Again, some of the tests will have these ranges on it. Like if you look at the National College of Naturopathic Medicine, they'll have their ranges. Commonwealth Labs will have some ranges too. I think it's another lab called Arrow Labs. They're another one that does SIBO as well.
I don't know if you saw BioHealth doing SIBO now. They just released it.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
Last week.
Oh, that's great. And it's breath testing?
Yep.
Oh, that's great. I'll have to subscribe for that test.
Yeah, I'll send you the clinician sheet about it here. And let's talk about some of the other causes too. So you talked about parasitic infections. Like if there is an infection in the gut, that could definitely cause SIBO because of the damage that's going to be done. And you talked about the diet a little bit too, in terms of like patients doing a lot better with a low FODMAP diet. So if we see like a lot of carbs, sugars, fructose, that's going to be an issue. If they were on PPIs before, what are the common brand names of the PPIs? Is it like a Prevacid? What is it called?
Yeah, you have Prevacid, you have Omeprazole, the generic, you have Nexium, you have Prilosec.
Which are all over the counter at this point. They almost all used to be prescription. I guess now the patents are up, so people can go and destroy their gut with these things by just jumping on a strong PPI like that. Candida, a lot of times if you have Candida, you'll have SIBO at the same time. If you went through antibiotics, let's say that you got like bronchitis or you got some type of sickness and the doctor threw you on a round of antibiotics, that can really be a good trigger for SIBO. And I'll see that a lot. That's one of my intake questions is, have you gone through a round of antibiotics recently? And a lot of people say yes. And so we don't necessarily have to go straight into the SIBO test. Like you say, if we get the stool panel run or the organic acids and we can see like infections and candida overgrowth, a lot of times the treatment for that is going to overlap and start working at getting rid of the SIBO in a way, right? If we're using some of these natural antimicrobials and herbs and say oregano, garlic, things like that, we may knock out the SIBO just as a byproduct of getting rid of a parasite or a bacterial infection.
Exactly. So when we look at that, one of the first dietary changes we'll do is I always typically start with an autoimmune diet because a lot of the symptoms of inflammation can be a lot of SIBO symptoms. So cutting out things like nuts and seeds and nightshade vegetables and even eggs, just off the bat, get them to a baseline of autoimmune kind of diet is a good place to start. And then from there, what we typically do is we assess. We'll reevaluate a few weeks later, see how we're doing. We'll probably add some hydrochloric acid and enzymes in because a lot of patients that have these issues, they'll have a history of being on PPIs, like I mentioned, these acid blocking medications. These acid blocking medications create further deficiencies in nutrients, such as various minerals like magnesium, selenium, zinc, and we need some of these nutrients for healthy thyroid, adrenal, relaxation, and even to make hydrochloric acid. So you can see once you have one of these underlying issues, it can tend to compound the problem and make it worse and worse over time. So then people continue to get worse over time, and they tend to go back and lean on those medications that caused the problem in the first place. So then you got this rabbit chasing its tail around, and the problem gets worse and worse over time.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. So just in terms of the diet piece, I often hear of like the specific carbohydrate diet, which In a way, I would say the autoimmune paleo diet's pretty close to the SCD, wouldn't you?
The autoimmune paleo diet is pretty close to the SCD. Yeah. So the SCD, when we look at the SCD, there's one out there by Allison Seebecker that's an SCD and a SIBO one, a low FODMAP one that's combined. So in my members area, my patients have access to this where we'll sometimes give the SCD in conjunction with the low FODMAP. So the SCD is called the specific carbohydrate diet. And what's different about the SCD is there's various phases of introducing foods. Typically, foods start off, they're really simple. It's just meats and maybe some carrots off the bat. Everything's peeled and even cooked pretty well or even mashed. So there's no outer coating. It's low in salicylates, low in phenols. So you have your meats, you have basically your carrots. And then the next phase, you may start to add in a couple more vegetables and maybe a little bit of apple or pear sauce. And then you go up into level 2 and level 3 and level 4, and you gradually introduce more and more foods. Now, if you're following a straight SCD or specific carbohydrate diet, that may still have some FODMAPs in it. So we got to be careful. So we may put a combination of an autoimmune / SCD and low FODMAP together. It really just depends on what the person's history is. If they have an underlying ulcerative colitis or Crohn's issue, we typically go autoimmune in conjunction with low FODMAP, in conjunction with kind of a low salicylate, low phenol SCD approach. Because some foods like potatoes are technically low in FODMAPs.
Right.
Same with tomatoes as well, right? Same with eggs. But people that have autoimmune stuff, they may be sensitive to those things. Even nuts are supposedly okay on a low FODMAP, right? Sometimes, right? If you look at Allison Seebecker's, they're considered to be okay. But if you look at other low FODMAP diets, nuts are not acceptable. And also nuts are not acceptable if you're on a autoimmune diet. So we get a little bit more strict in how we approach things just because I have, hundreds of data points of patients doing well in this approach. So it's really tough off the bat. It's not meant for a forever thing, but it's meant to just kind of cross our T's, dot our I's, find out what foods we're sensitive to, cut out some of the inflammation, and significantly reduce a lot of the bloating and gas and a lot of those constipation and diarrhea SIBO symptoms as we get the person better.
Yeah, and a lot of people, if they've suffered long enough, they're open to that and they're willing to do that. But if some people, they haven't gone strict with the diet, it may feel like we're taking a lot of good stuff away from you. But this is going to help to speed up your process of you getting better. Because if we're relying just on one treatment, whether it's the herbs or some of the other botanicals, you can get better, but it may take longer. So like Justin's saying here, if we're improving the diet and stacking that on top of the good lifestyle, getting the good sleep, all the other factors still are important. That's just going to make sure that you get better faster. And that's a question that we often ask is, how quickly do you want to get better? And that will determine, how deep or how intense we can go with stacking all of these things on top of one another and maintaining a normal life that's pretty free of symptoms overall.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. 100%. So regarding some of the testing I mentioned, the glucose testing to look more in the upper small intestine, the upper stomach tract. Lactulose is typically, the best one, so to speak, because of the slow breakdown of the lactulose. Again, if we have some type of gastroparesis or some type of significant motility issue, it may take longer for that lactulose to get down there, and we may see an issue with that being delayed on the breath test. Like if we're only doing a 2-hour breath test, right, like the Genova one, but it takes 3 hours to get down there, we may miss that infection, right? So some people will actually have them wait an extra hour, then start the test at the first hour in, and then we can get a good window of that. So there's also, if it's a faster motility, then it may go too fast. So you got to have to kind of weigh the odds of both of those different testing there. And then also I did a whole video on how to do some of these tests, all right, and like what the data says and what we're looking at. But I kind of mentioned some of the things. Greater than 3 on the methane and 15 to 20 tends to be the point that we want to look at for hydrogen and or methane. Typically 20 or above combined hydrogen methane is positive, 15 or above for hydrogen. And again, that can change from test to test. So I did a deeper video on that and how to interpret it.
Great. Yeah, and so it looks like BioHealth is going to be a better solution than the Genova. Looks like it's a 3-hour test here with 10 breath samples. So I think this might be the new gold standard for us.
Oh, I like that. That's great. I'm going to have to order one and get access to that ASAP. Yeah, I see. May 23rd, it just came out. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Very cool. So regarding testing, we already talked about kind of my philosophy looking at the upstream infections. That's important. Now, there's a lot of people out there, a few people out there I can think of off the bat that are not in favor of adrenal testing. Now, I understand where these people are coming from, these clinicians. I don't necessarily agree because I think people have significant inflammation on their backs and on their bodies, and they have a very difficult time regulating it. And when we see someone that has decent adrenals but has gut symptoms, that matters versus someone that has very impaired adrenals. And what I mean by impaired, let's say a flat adrenal rhythm, or let's say a reverse cortisol rhythm, and or very low depleted sex hormones. Now, some of these clinicians are basing this off of symptoms, but I can tell you many times that I get surprised every now and then. And now that I'm doing the 201 by BioHealth and the newer Dutch testing, you'd be surprised how often you get surprised with some of these people's clinical presentations. And sometimes when I see that, then I go to the thyroid, and it's really the thyroid that's really the weak link in the chain. So I'm a big fan of looking at the adrenals because it gives me the ability to look at what that patient's capacity for regulating inflammation and stress is. It also gives me a window into their sex hormone output, so how fast they can heal, and also how dysregulated is their cortisol rhythm. Right, the Whitehall-Hurst study found that the closer that morning cortisol is to that nighttime cortisol, an increased risk of cancer even greater than cigarette smoking. So cortisol rhythm to me is important, and it also gives patients, when they come in with a real crappy rhythm or very low sex hormones, it gives them a bullseye to shoot for. So it really creates a significant level of compliance because that patient knows they got a test in 6 months that they're studying for, so to speak. And by studying, I mean doing all the diet and lifestyle things and being compliant with the treatment, because then we can follow up and see how we're doing, and then we can have a real specific treatment. So to a lot of those doctors out there, I think they're missing the boat a little bit, and I think they would get better patient compliance. And I think they'd be surprised that some patients that are probably slipping through the cracks because their adrenals are terrible, and that would allow them to provide a better prognosis on where they're going based on their patient's inability to regulate stress and inflammation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And that ties into the gut. People may think, well, why are you talking about adrenals? But this whole adrenal cascade, this is going to affect the gut. So, which we may have talked about briefly in another episode. If you're unable to regulate your inflammation because you do have adrenal issues, then that's going to leave you more susceptible to the gut. So if you're only focusing on the gut, and what a lot of practitioners do, I mainly think for marketing purposes, is to kind of pigeonhole themselves into being, say, a SIBO specialist or a gut specialist. But you honestly can't get people better 100% if you are a specialist. Is that a safe statement to make? Because if you're only focusing on SIBO and you're just killing off all of these bacteria, but yet they have wrecked adrenals and the leaky gut situation is still there because they have, say, high cortisol all day, you can't get someone ultimately better. It seems like they'll just spin their wheels.
Yeah, I think it's great to be able to market to the public as you specialize in this area, but I think it's important that you still, flex your holistic muscles, that, yeah, even though I specialize in here, I still connect in the adrenals. I still connect in the gut. I
Right.
still connect in the detoxification issues along with it. So even though we're really focused on this one issue, we are not myopically focused where everything else becomes non-existent in our periphery.
Exactly.
So I
That's
think
well
I think
said.
that's really important because that's where conventional medicine's kind of gone wrong, where the cardiologist only knows about the heart and doesn't know about the hormones, and vice versa for the endocrinologist and the gastrointestinal doctor, right? But we know how important all of those things are connected.
Yep, absolutely. I had another thought, and I think I lost it. It was about, just in terms of SIBO. I've already kind of said this, so I may be repeating myself, but basically, if someone is just throwing themselves on the antibiotics or the herbal antibiotics, you may spin your wheels. And you were talking about how the importance of adrenal testing, even for gut issues. Last week, I had a female in her 60s. If I would have guessed, I know you and I kind of put things in our head about, I think this person's going to show up like this. I would have guessed that she was flatlined with her cortisol. However, she had a sum of over 60. Her cortisol sum was insanely high, and her cortisol rhythm was insanely high, yet she had tons of fatigue, yet had some anxiety in the evening. So I thought, maybe we'd see an elevation in the evening. No, her cortisol was just off the charts, the highest I've ever seen ever. And now I found that out, and I wouldn't have been able to start working on the fatigue. If I would have thrown her on something stimulating like licorice, I would have created a disaster for that woman. She would have felt worse. So without that piece, it's really scary to jump on a program.
Exactly. And the big thing we're trying to do in functional medicine is we're trying to use objective lab testing to really drive compliance, because patients have been told already that come seeing us that it's all in their head. And they need something to show, hey, this is a window under the hood of what's happening with your physiology, your hormones, and your biochemistry. It's real. And then now from that, we're going to retest in a certain amount of time. So the pressure's on you to be compliant. So then they know, hey, we're going to be making these changes and we're going to be retesting. So they got to do their part. And then also it makes sure that we aren't guessing, we are assessing, because I get surprised every now and then. So I think some people are missing the boat on that from a clinical standpoint. I understand why they do it, because they're hyper focused on cost and such. And I get it if someone, has significant financial issues and they don't want to do a certain test. But my issue is you wait 2 or 3 months and they're not quite feeling where they want to. Almost everyone regrets not running that test 2 or 3 months ago. Right? It's never, maybe they start getting better and you're like, great, it worked out. But if you don't feel better in a couple of months, then you're going to really wish you did that test, because then you have a little more confidence in what direction you're moving forward with regarding your treatment for your SIBO issues.
Yeah. And that's sort of like if you're buying something really cheaply, like say you just buy a little piece that made fit the job for a tool that you needed at home, but then that screwdriver breaks. Now you have to go buy another screwdriver, and then that one breaks, and then eventually you're like, you know what, I'm going to buy a screwdriver with a lifetime warranty. It's going to last you a lot better, but yet you've spent double or triple because you've been trying to only use an incomplete puzzle, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yep.
Like if we try to focus on, let's just look at adrenals, and that's what I did in the beginning, because I was trying to just prioritize things for people. And now I've come to the conclusion, and you have a long time ago, this conclusion, we really don't want to just look at this one piece. We really have to try to get this full puzzle up front with someone, because then we're delaying the success that they get, and then they blame us. But we don't have the data, so we can't work without the data.
Exactly. So I always tell patients, the longer you've been sick, the more sick you are, and the faster you want to get better. It's better to pull a couple more labs out so we have a more complete picture. The shorter you've been sick, the better you feel, and the less motivated you are to get better. Then we can start with just something like one test. But I always tell patients it's better to do something over nothing, because then we can start moving forward versus, sliding backwards.
Right.
So a couple more things on the SIBO. A couple of the herbs that I formulated and use. I use a couple in my practice. One's called GI Clear 1 and one's called GI Clear 6. These are some various herbs I use that have some high amounts of berberines, artemisia compounds in there, cloves, Java brucea, wild indigo, just various herbs that have shown to be very sensitive to killing some of the gut bacterial overgrowth. Okay, that's number one. There are some other ones out. There's been studies looking at the antibiotics, the neomycin or the rifaximin, and rifaximin is the same thing as Xifaxan, FYI. And then the combination of the neomycin with the herbs. So looking at just the antibiotics and then looking at just the herbs, there's been some studies showing that the herbs actually work better. Now, when in doubt, if you're going to just say, well, I want to go the antibiotics, still go with the herbs, because the herbs have a really good effect at knocking out biofilms too. And some of the antibiotics won't touch the biofilms. That's number one. And then number two, people need a longer dose of these antibiotics. And people that do long dose antibiotics can wipe out a lot of their beneficial flora. So combining it, if they are, with the herbs are going to be beneficial, because herbs are shown to be just better clinically. Taking it over the long period, safer, less side effects than a lot of the antibiotics would. And you have couple 10,000-year history with these herbs being used by various tribes and cultures to help with infections and parasite stuff, and like wormwood with malaria, and like mastica on the island of Chios in Greece for all kinds of different issues with H. pylori and other issues. So it's nice to use the herbs. I'm biased towards the herbs because of their safety, because of their long-term history, and because of our ability to use it long-term, and the ability to affect things like efflux pumps, which are kind of the bacterial way of bailing water out of a sinking ship. So imagine antibiotics coming in and the ship bailing those antibiotics back into the intestinal tract, creating more bacterial overgrowth because it's knocking out a lot of the good stuff. So those efflux pumps get affected more by the the herbs, and they also affect some of the biofilms, which are like the protective shields that these infections use to protect themselves from getting killed.
Yeah, I've seen a few studies about enteric coated peppermint oil as well.
Yep.
And I used that when I was suffering a lot with IBS. I wasn't into the herbs. I didn't know enough about the herbs at that point. So I was using the peppermint oil, and I had great success. And that's something I've given to my dad too. He's had a lot of issues with his gut, and it's been incredibly helpful. It's hard to find a clear piece of research that says whether you would be able to use the enteric coated peppermint oil specifically for treatment of SIBO, like if you can knock it out by itself. What do you think? Maybe in a low overgrowth situation, it could give you some antimicrobial benefit, but I think you're probably going to need a bit more of a well-rounded approach by adding in the herbs on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, typically I would never rely just on one herb by itself. I would do a combination of a couple. If you look at my GI Clear 1 and GI Clear 6, we do that in those products. And my GI Clear 5, that's the pure emulsified oil of oregano, we'll hit that up really hard as well. And then we'll even use my GI Clear 3, which is silver, and that's a really good biofilm buster. And then we always like to throw in ginger because there's a lot of research on ginger busting out biofilms too. So we do a combination of different things, and we'll even interject the low FODMAP diet. And sometimes we'll even start eating a little bit of FODMAPs while we're doing the killing, because it's kind of like putting cheese on a mousetrap for the so-called mouse, i.e. the bacteria, to come out of hiding. When it comes out, boom, we use those herbs and really knock them down to size.
That's great. That's really interesting concept there.
And look at your situation, right? You would have what I would consider to have be a lot of SIBO symptoms. Like if you went to one of these SIBO docs that are out there, the first thing they would have had you done was SIBO testing, without a doubt. But look, what came back on a stool culture, right? We're talking an actual, under the microscope, stain/culture diagnosis. You came back with Giardia and crypto, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. You did a breath test, you'd have came back and they'd have been just all 100% myopically focused on the gases. Oh, that was methane and hydrogen are high. We got to knock them down. But if you looked upstream, you'd see you'd have two major infections that would have been missed.
Yep, I know. And I would have suffered. Maybe depending on how heavy hitting the treatment would have been for the SIBO. If it was a very heavy hitting treatment, tons of garlic, tons of the oregano, the berberine.
They may have got it by accident, right?
Exactly. But I wouldn't have known. And let's just say, what if I did the SIBO treatment for a shorter duration than necessary to get rid of the parasites? Then my symptoms would have come back. And then I would have been, well, that didn't work. Why not?
Right.
So,
especially a lot of these SIBO infections aren't known to be as contagious like these parasite infections are. These parasite infections can be fecal oral, can be spread by intimacy, where not quite as much as with the general SIBO stuff, right? Because a SIBO really is a whole bunch of different bacteria that are just overgrown, so to speak. So we wouldn't think of that as being like a contamination or a potential, thing that can be vectored per se. But when we deal with infections, H. pylori to kind of be added in there, we have a different perspective on the spouses and the partners that could be affected in there and contaminated with.
Yep. So I think that's a pretty good overview. We talked about the testing, getting the full panel run, making sure you're getting some stool testing run with your practitioner, making sure you're getting some adrenal testing to see how much is this cortisol issue, how much is that contributing to your leaky gut, making you more susceptible to pick up bacterial and yeast overgrowths and parasite infections. And then we talked about some of the herbs and then combining those for the synergy. We talked about the diet in terms of watching out for the FODMAPs, potentially doing like an SCD or an autoimmune paleo diet for the time being, then reintroducing things, seeing how you feel. Is that the four pillars? Is there any other missing piece?
Yeah, for the most part. Let me just go through it in my head. We have the 5 R's, so we're removing all the bad foods, right? This could be, but not limited to, autoimmune foods, SCD, low cutting out the higher phenols and salicylates, cutting out the FODMAPs, and potentially even cutting out histamines. The more messed up someone's gut is, the more they have to be diligent and vigilant on their diet in the beginning. So some of these things may have to be removed. Next R would be the replacing enzymes and acids to really help with the breakdown of these foods. Third R would be repairing the gut lining, and or adding in repairing nutrients to reduce inflammation. So we may add in some specific strands of probiotics to help with the inflammation on the repair side, and also the adrenal piece. right? Helping to regulate inflammation better so we can put out the fire in our gut. And we also know the adrenals are important for IgA production. Very low cortisol will affect IgA. So the repair involves potential probiotics, potential anti-inflammatory nutrients, and potential adrenal support. Fourth R is removing the infections, anywhere from the parasite to the bacterial issue to the fungal overgrowth to the SIBO. And the fifth R is going to be reinoculation, where we really focus on the probiotics. Even though it's not a forever kind of thing, it still has an effect of reseeding at least for a month at a time. And then the last piece after those 5 R's are completed are retesting, making sure there's no lingering infections that come to the surface.
Nice. Well said.
Yeah.
And I like how you painted out the order of operations there, and you did not say probiotics first. I think you and I discussed a female patient I had where she went to the naturopath, threw her on like a heavy dose of the soil-based probiotics, and she blew up like a balloon, felt awful, tons of symptoms. Wrong order, wrong treatment.
Yeah, and also if we're going to do specific kind of probiotics, I'm a bigger fan with my sensitive gut patients to use one called Megaspore. Yeah. It's typically a Bacillus clausii, subtilis, coagulans, bacillus kind of spore-like strain. It tends to be more sensitive to people that are what I call probiotic intolerant. They get a lot of gassiness and bloating and digestive symptoms from probiotics.
Yeah, she felt horrible, and I was so glad to finally see in the flesh, just because treatment sounds good, you just talked about the 5 R's. You can't just go straight to number 5. You have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Most people want to go to number 5 or number 4 because it's sexy, right? Oh, probiotics and this. It's just sexy. But number 1 off the bat, before we have the 5 R's, is going to be get some testing done, right? Ideally, let's say you try cutting the FODMAPs out and you've done an AIP, great. If you're getting results, good. I strongly encourage you at some point to dig in and get some testing done. Right, that's where looking at the body systems would be super helpful. Organic acid testing and or adrenal and or gut testing would be helpful. The more symptoms, we may dig into thyroid stuff. That way we get a complete picture. The worst thing you want to be doing is guessing and then having all these things happening where you're starting to get worse over time and you don't know, and you start getting scared and you're like, well, what do I do next? Having the testing is super helpful, and having a clinician that's been there a couple thousand times really gives you a lot of confidence because, if I'm climbing Mount Everest and something happens, I want to have a Sherpa or someone with me that's been up that mountain dozens of times that knows the ins and outs.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
Any other comments on that? So we have the testing. We talked about the SIBO testing. We talked about the breath testing. And just to kind of correlate symptoms, increase in methane gas can typically mean constipation. Increase in hydrogen typically means diarrhea. We can have both. We can be alternating. So it's nice to be able to coin some of those symptoms, right? Either diarrhea or constipation of some of the gases. It may hold true, it may not. And we talked about the different testing, either the endoscopy sample. We talked about the breath testing. We talked about the actual gut testing as well, looking for the parasites. And then we talked about the periphery testing, either the adrenals or deeper organic acid testing to look downstream.
Yeah, I would say the only thing I would add to that is don't be alarmed necessarily. This is a good conversation to have with your specific practitioner, but don't be alarmed if things do get a little bit worse before they get better, especially if there's like a parasite like I was dealing with. Things got a little bit worse before they got better. So don't assume that it's just going to be a miracle solution. There may be this readjustment period that you're going to have to work through, a couple of speed bumps along the way, but that can be normal to have an exacerbation of symptoms before they get better. And that may be okay. Yeah. But you need to talk with your practitioner and make sure.
Yeah, and some good references on the mainstream for this article here, or this podcast, will be Dr. Pimentel out of the Cedars-Sinai over at California, Los Angeles there. Also Allison Seebecker and Dr. Sandberg Lewis out of NCNM over at National College of Naturopathic Medicine. Those are some good resources and references on the whole SIBO thing here, outside of, if you want to kind of dig into the nitty-gritty. Those are some good places to look.
Good stuff.
Any other questions, Evan, or comments or concerns?
Not for today.
Like it, man. Well, go out and get sick people well, and I'll do the same.
Amen.
Have a good one, and best of luck with summer coming into the world.
Oh, thank you.
Take care, Evan.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Got a question for Dr. J? Go to BeyondWellnessRadio.com and click the questions button. Then tune in to hear the answer. Also, if you like the show, click below to review us on iTunes. For more Beyond Wellness Radio, go to BeyondWellnessRadio.com.